Curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
more than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Center's program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to all member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the platform.
Moderator of this conversation. Thank you very much for being with us today in this conversation about the deviation of weapons and public security and development in the Americas. Before we start, I would like to inform you that this conversation is being broadcast through the web in the social networks of OAS, Facebook, Zoom, YouTube. For those that are with us in Zoom, we have simultaneous interpretation into English and Spanish. You can select the language of your preference in the lower screen, in the globe icon. If you have any inconvenience with the audio or interpretation, please kindly write on the chat and our team will provide the necessary support. Also, I ask the participants to maintain their microphones off so as not to interrupt the presentations. If you want to intervene as the presentations finish, please do so through the raise hand function and request the floor. For the general public, the general audience with us, thank you for your interest in this topic. It's extremely important to provide all of us as a society to prevent and fight the illicit traffic of weapons in the region. Through YouTube, you can select the channel with the language of your preference. Greeting also to the national and international experts and the representatives of the member states for accepting this invitation. I'd like to point out that your experience and knowledge are key elements for this conversation. I'd also like to give a special salute to the permanent representative of Mexico in OAS, Lucelena Baños, our panelists of this event, and particularly special greeting to all the women that are with us in this event today, March 8th. We know how violence and criminality affect women differently, and it's in a differentiated way, and it's important for them to occupy spaces like today to reduce those breaches of inequality. This conversation includes a series of events from the committee to counter the illicit traffic of firearms, and it's organized by the government of Mexico that uses the precedents of the American Convention against the manufacture of firearms, weapons, explosives, and other materials related, known as IFTR. Also with the support of the Department versus Transnational Organized Crime and the Public Security Department of OAS. As we know, the Americas are one of the regions most affected by violence in the world. Today, we intend to seek dialogue between governments, private sector, and civil society to discuss the link between armed violence and the deviation and traffic of firearms. Challenges of countries to increase effective strategies to avoid the problem, and other courses of action for international cooperation. So there, I would like to thank the government of Mexico for their protagonism in this topic and the efforts to operativize and strengthen the CIFTA. Without preamble, I'd like to offer the floor the Ambassador Lucelena Baños, permanent representative of Mexico in the OAS, who will welcome us. Ambassador, you have the floor. Good morning to you all, Guillermo. Thank you very much. We thank your participation in the first public conversation on illicit firearms organized from Mexico by the Conference of States in collaboration with the Ministry of Multidimensional Security Commission of OAS. Mexico has placed particular attention to the efforts for sharing illicit traffic of firearms because of the devastating effects in security in our countries. The consequences of the illicit traffic of firearms are multiple and intersectorial and include the deterioration of the social issue and the development of people and the government infrastructure and the public security bodies and the loss of income in various activities such as commercial and tourism as a result of armed violence that has taken up many lives. This is why with the company of the technical ministry, the permanent mission of Mexico has opened the spaces for dissemination of the efforts conducted to go on this problem in all of its dimensions. Today, we will focus on the deep impact that the illicit traffic of firearms has on public security. Therefore, we've summoned experts on the issue that will help us understand the situation where we are, and they'll provide responses to ameliorate the deterioration of the social tissue of our communities. It's not casual that this conversation will take place in the framework of the International Women's Day. Armed violence has a differentiated impact in women and children, and the traffic of firearms is an affront against their human rights. They vulnerate their security and integrity and their right to life. To widely understand the terrible consequences of the traffic of firearms, we must go over the problem from the victim's point of view. The impact that women and girls suffer to these felonies is reflected in the increase of violence, gender violence, sexual exploitation, and violence at home. And it's presented more strongly in the family environment when girls or women are focused on taking care of the victims of armed violence. The office of our disarmament office of the United Nations shows that the rate of feminicides increases in countries with wide availability of firearms. So it's necessary to have methodologies to measure and analyze such a serious problem as this, to work on the production of public policies that allow us to face it. The statistics of homicides, for example, allow us to know the extension of our violence and to have data that give evidence of the number of illegal weapons. However, the difficulty to track firearms and deficient investigation on the crime of illegal carrying uh, show a problem with the vulnerabilities in the change of custody and the life cycle of the weapons. For this reason, among others, Mexico finances in OAS the development of the methodology to drive the study on illicit traffic in the Americas that will feature this phenomenon and identify the capacities to properly face it. In the context of the world, it's important to strengthen the multilateral spaces and remember that through dialogue and cooperation, we can design strategies to face common problems. The American states must use the robust legal system, inter-American legal system that we have, because through instruments like CETA, ratified by 31 member states, we can face traffic of weapons and illicit proliferation of firearms from a coordinated perspective and, of course, presidential perspective. We hope that this first event will be very useful for all and that you will participate in the next one that will take place on April 5th, the International Day to counter the manufacture and illicit traffic of firearms. In this second edition, we will focus on the links between traffic of firearms and asset laundering. I thank the presence of the distinguished panelists today and the work of the Department of Public Security of the OAS, whose director, Guillermo Moncayo, will moderate this conversation. Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for your participation. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your kind welcome words. Your words undoubtedly encourage us to continue working on this topic, on this issue. I'd like to thank all the support from the Mexico government and their priority on the agenda on proliferation of firearms from your country. So with no further ado, we'd like to start with the panel and start with the productive dialogue of today. I'll present the methodology today. I will be your moderator, so I'll ask the panelists. You'll have 12 minutes to present on topics such as traffic and commerce of firearms and armed violence, strengths and weaknesses on state capacities to control the cycle of firearms, the strategies to strengthen the national capacities and control firearms, and the role of the private sector on preventing and fighting illicit traffic. I kindly ask the panelists to use the allotted time. I'll tell you how long you have. I'll give you a warning, 3 minutes and 1 minute. So once finalized the intervention of the panelists, we'll have a dialogue session with questions from the audience. So please send your questions through the chat on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook. The team will be very attentive to your questions. To start the presentations, I have the honor of giving the floor to the legal consultant of the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Mexico. Alejandro Solar, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you, Ambassador Luz Helena Baños and all the team of Mexico Mission with the Organization of American States for facilitating this conversation. Well said by the ambassador that it's important that this conversation is had on the international Women's Day. We all condemn the violence against women, and allows me to start my presentation with a piece of information, revealing piece of information that should cause annoyance, indignation, but also it will allow us to envision some opportunities to advance on the topic of weapon control. Violence against women in Mexico, homicide against women in Mexico, unfortunately, has increased in 375% in the last 2 decades. More than 30% of homicides against women are committed with firearms. And if there are considerations on the legal regime, the strengths of the legal and law application systems, there's something that we can't ignore. The weapons used to kill women in Mexico and in the region, these weapons shouldn't exist in Mexico. And why do I say that with such clarity? In Mexico, there's only one office where permits are requested to own firearms. And even with this permit, a very strict system, a very difficult system to overcome for private people. This office is managed by the Ministry of Defense. The weapons in that office is reduced caliber. These weapons, we are talking about weapons that can be used for legitimate defense at home, for recreational activities, we are not discussing the kind of weapons, the kind of military weapons that we find today in Mexico. It's very important to bear in mind this idea of what's happened in these past 2 decades in our region. An increase, dramatic increase on the violence situation, armed violence situation, the existence of military style weapons in our region. Coincidentally, 2 decades ago, in 2004, a prohibition was suspended for the manufacture of assault weapons or military style weapons in the United States. And also coincidentally, close to 2 decades ago, the US legislation approved a federal law that grants certain immunities against civil liabilities versus companies that manufacture, distribute, and sell weapons for damage happened on US soil. So we have an increase on armed violence and indiscriminate production of firearms, military-style firearms, and a law that allows for some immunities to certain companies in the United States for happenstances in United States. For that situation, the government of Mexico, from the beginning of the present administration, President López Obrador and the leadership of Chancellor Ebrard, trying to find a different way to take care of armed violence, a formula that would bring us away from solving bullets, solving violence with violence, what will generate, as we have experienced in Mexico and surely in your countries, there have been similar situations. Violence versus violence is an ascending spiral of violence where the sole beneficiaries are those that manufacture, distribute, and sell weapons, because on one hand, they facilitate the illicit traffic of them in our countries, and on the other hand, they sell legally, they export legally to the armed forces and security forces that must react to criminals that possess and carry and use military-style weapons with high firepower. These are criminals that are prosecuted under a criminal system that use military-style weapons, weapons that, as I said at the beginning, cannot be acquired legally in Mexico. So in this context, the Chancellor Ebrard has disposed an idea that I believe you will agree with it. For decades, many decades, we've focused on illicit traffic of weapons from the customs perspective, how we can prevent weapons from coming to our countries. I understand how to prevent weapons from leaving our countries. That's a customs situation. We've focused on bilateral efforts of better coordination of information exchange, of requests and extraditions and traffickers, weapon traffickers, and the reinforcing of our domestic law in the multilateral environment, also the SIFTA effect, and going into the structuring of a model where we all understand better how to prosecute the illicit traffic of weapons. We've focused on what governments can do, but as the Chancellor said in the Security Council on November 22nd last year, we have the opportunity as governments to encourage our companies to self-regulate, modify their commercial practices, and participate in the actions to prevent illicit traffic of weapons that generate armed violence and damage in our countries. So facing that, and I'll use the time to share the effort that I have, the privilege that I have to face and coordinate Government of Mexico on August 4th, 2021, presented a civil suit for damage at a federal courtroom in the U.S. This civil damage suit is a tort law, under the understanding of a tort law. If an individual or a company causes damage, I have the right to ask for repair. So in this formulation of an action, of a legal action, a very simple legal action, the government of Mexico presents itself as a victim of a damage. What's the damage? Well, violence, direct damage or indirect damage that we've suffered for illicit trafficking of weapons that is facilitated actively by the commercial actions, the decisions, the business decisions that are negligent and illicit from the companies that we are suing. This is a very simple demand. The damaged party, the government of Mexico, the party that was elected as responsible, these companies, 8 companies, which represent close to 70% of the weapons identified, tracked, impounded from the crime in Mexico. This is not a suit against the government of the United States. It is not a suit against the Americans. This is not against the Second Amendment. It is a law in the Constitution of the United States of America that establishes a series of rights regarding their relationship of their nationals, residents in the U.S. with the weapons trade. So here, allow me to stop to make a reflection that will allow us to have a deeper conversation. There is a model of business, a system of weapons trade in the United States, where there are dozens, hundreds, thousands of point of sale places where a person can acquire a military rifle, a semi-automatic rifle, that easily can be modified to become a machine gun that shows a blast. You can buy it with an ID and being 18 years old. But as that happens in the US, and again, the government of Mexico personally, we recognized and respect the decision, the sovereign decision of the United States of having this model of weapons trade. But in Mexico, we don't have that model. So what happens? Well, criminals, the people, and the criminal organizations that wish to have weapons to use and cause damage in Mexico, since they can't get them in our country, they get them in the United States. How do they get them? Through different names. Person buys a weapon, they identify themselves, they purchase it, and they can return it to Mexican territory and maybe a territory of some of the countries represented here. Multiple sales. Person can buy 5, 10 weapons, semi-automatic rifles in the same transaction. They can do that. Sale of inventory sales, the points of sale that simply announce that they lost or they were stolen, when actually they are facilitating them to the criminal organizations. These are only some of the negligent activities that we question in our lawsuit. Why, if these companies know that their products end up in Mexico and in our countries, that can't be a surprise because there are government reports, there are reports of international organizations, videos in social networks, there are series in TV networks where we show that their products are being used like that, the way they sell their weapons. They are aimed to a commerce that should not exist because, as I repeat, Mexico and many of our countries, they can't be, those weapons cannot be acquired. So I concluded this presentation on the lawsuit. What is it we see with this lawsuit? It's not preventing weapons trade. If there must be commerce, it should be transparent, regulated, and with what does that mean? What does accountability mean? Is that companies are more careful in the way they trade, so that their products are not manufactured illicitly. The way they advertise their weapons is actually aimed to collection sport activities, not war activities. And finally, that they become responsible for the damage caused by their products. Like any other industry, they become responsible for the damage caused by their products. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll be attentive to your questions and comments. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this presentation. You have 1 minute left on the clock. I have 1 minute to use later. Thank you again for that presentation that shows us the various problems and the importance of having effective control mechanisms on access to firearms, considering the transnationality of the problem. So it's essential, the protagonism of the governments is essential in visualizing the proliferation of firearms that causes in the citizens of the Americans, and also adopt measures to fight it. Now, let's move to the presentation of the representatives of the Ministry of National Security of Jamaica, Samantha Allen and Ricardo Edwards. Go ahead. Go ahead, Samantha and Ricardo. You have the floor.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So again, I'm Samantha Allen, and I'm currently the Senior Director for Protective Security and Small Arms here at the Ministry of National Security in Jamaica. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Mr. Ricardo Edwards. So we will be jointly doing this presentation this morning. So I'm just going to share my screen. And while I'm sharing, I would also like to just thank the government of Mexico again for allowing myself and Ricardo to be a part of this important discussion this morning. It's certainly an honor for us to be invited to speak at this event, and we welcome the feedback from the participants as well. So let me see. Okay, so is everyone seeing the screen? Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, Samantha.
Okay.
We see it.
Let me. All right. So just a brief background, outline. So I'll just go through a brief background of our national situation in Jamaica. We will also look at the impact of illicit trafficking of firearms as it pertains to the proliferation of illegal firearms in Jamaica. Sorry, so yeah, the proliferation of illegal firearms in Jamaica, and also share some data as it pertains to just the level of crime and violence that we are seeing as a result of firearms coming into our country, and the impact from that perspective. And much of that data would be coming from our research team at the ministry, and it is also informed by a national crime victimization survey that we routinely conduct at the national level. And following that now, we will just outline some of the things that the government has done as it pertains to trying to respond to this significant issue that we currently face as it pertains to firearms, illegal firearms coming into the country. So I'll just give a brief overview of our legislation initiatives and what our new domestic legislation will seek to entail in treating with the situation, as well as some of our operational measures that we have implemented, and also from the perspective of cooperation, some of the initiatives that we have also implemented in terms of engaging with our regional and international partners with a view to prevent the illicit trafficking and diversion of Jamaica, and to support all efforts in that regard. So background from the perspective of us, a small island developing state in the Caribbean, we have numerous ports of entry. So we are significantly challenged in terms of us manning all of our ports of entry at this point in time. We also find ourselves in the middle of the licit as well as the illicit trafficking routes. So we are uniquely placed, and we find that as a result of that, we are significantly impacted by a lot of transnational organized criminal activities, primarily the illicit trafficking of firearms and ammunition, as well as other contraband. So Jamaica is not an importer or manufacturer, but we do find ourselves with a situation where a lot of weapons are coming into the country through our legal ports as well as our unofficial ports. And most of these weapons are indeed illegal firearms. We have also seen, based on our trends and patterns, that illegal firearms are currently used to commit much of the crimes that we are currently confronted with, in particular murders. Since 2019, over 80% of the murders in Jamaica we have found have been attributed to the use of firearms, and most of these firearms are in fact illegal guns. And so this is also reflected by the increased seizures of the illegal weapons by our police, as well as ammunition, which is on an annual basis. We do see a pattern where there is a significant number of firearms and ammunition that is seized annually, which would suggest and confirm that there is in fact the proliferation of illegal firearms within the country. Now, we have some data here that I'm going to just invite my colleague, Mr. Edwards, to just sort of give a breakdown in terms of some of the figures and what we are seeing in terms of our review and assessment of the crime and activities, and in particular murders that have been committed over the past decades. So I'll now hand over to Ricardo.
Good morning, colleagues.
You can go ahead, Ricardo.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And all right, I will proceed. So good morning again, and thanks for the invitation. We're going to take a look at serious and major crimes. The situation in Jamaica is quite interesting because what we're seeing is that serious and major crimes have been declining in the last 10 years, with figures moving from 10,711 in 2011 to 5,222 in 2021. And you see in the cascading line there. So we move to the next slide. Apologies for that, as we sort out the. All right. So we have noted a general reduction in major crimes. But despite the reduction in major crimes, what we're seeing is that the murder rate continues to increase in the case of Jamaica. And it's also in the case of other countries in the Americas. Jamaica's murder rate moved from 41.9 per 100,000 in 2011 and to 53.5 in 2021. And interestingly, globally, the murder rate is 7.2 per 100,000. Regionally, and this is the Americas, it's 17.2. So globally, Jamaica's murder rate is approximately 8 times the global rate, and regionally about three times the regional rate. My colleague pointed out this fact that firearms are involved in approximately 80% of all murders committed. When we look at the figures globally and regionally, we're seeing some variations. Globally, approximately half of murders would involve the use of firearms, and while regionally, it's about 3 in every 4 involve the use of a firearm. Firearm seizures, a total of over 7,000 firearms would have been seized by the security forces between 2011 to 2021. With the exception of 2021, firearm seizures have been declining in Jamaica. As it relates to ammunitions, what we have noted is that over 100,000 ammunitions have been seized from 2011 to 2022. But despite there is a fluctuation which is shown here from 2011, where 4,975 firearms would have been seized, when compared to 2020, where 8,790 would have been seized. And you're seeing for 2017, where we had that over 20,000 firearms would have been seized, but on average, over 10,000 ammunitions are seized on an annual basis. I'm going to quickly jump to the Jamaica Crime Victimization Survey and share some information emerging out of that survey. Firearm was the second most common weapon reported in robberies. So of all the victims who reported that they were robbed within that period, firearms would have been used in approximately 46% of the cases. All right, with respect to physical assault and threats, we also see in the usage of firearms. There was a question that was asked in the JNCVS survey. Do you or any other member of your household had a gun, hunting rifle, or any other type of firearm to protect yourself or for other uses? And what we found was that the majority of Jamaicans reported that they do not have a firearm, even though a small percentage, approximately 1%, reported that they do have a firearm. With respect to seeing non-security personnel with firearms in their community, most Jamaicans, when asked, have you ever see any non-security personnel with firearms in your community? Most Jamaicans said they have never seen any such cases. Notwithstanding, you have a combined total of 8% of the population who reported that they saw non-security personnel with guns in their neighborhood. And this would have accounted for about 200,000 Jamaicans based on the current population.
Ricardo, 3 minutes.
Finally, do you believe the availability of a gun in your household contributes to a greater sense of security? And this is an interesting question, as it shows to what extent guns can be used for personal security. Most respondents said no, a gun in the household would not contribute to a greater sense of security. Notwithstanding, you had a large number of respondents saying yes, it would. And just to sum up the major findings, the country has recorded success in reducing serious and major crimes over the last 10 years. In fact, we have cut the numbers by half when compared to 2011. Notwithstanding, access to illegal firearms remain a significant concern for the government, as demonstrated in 1, the high murder rate.
The recording has stopped.
Attributed to the use of
This meeting is being
2,
recorded.
the relatively high number of illegal firearms and ammunition seized, and 3, the fact that 1 in 10 Jamaicans reported seeing non-security personnel with guns in their communities. So I now hand over to my colleague to share some of the actions and strategies that will have been taken by the government.
Samantha?
Okay, thank you so much, Ricardo. All right, so I'm going to just quickly go through what the government has done so far in light of this significant challenge that we are faced with. So we have basically adopted a multi-pronged approach in trying to address the issue. So we have basically looked at our domestic law with a view to reform the current Firearms Act. We have also looked from the operational perspective on what we can do from the perspective of law enforcement, as well as border controls, and also trade in terms of reducing and preventing the diversion as well as the trafficking of arms. And then we also looked at some of the avenues that we can explore in terms of our international partners and how we can strengthen those links. So
1 minute, Samantha.
domestically, as it pertains to the Firearms Act, we decided to completely repeal and replace the Act in light of the fact that the challenge that we are faced with now is with respect to illegal firearms. We saw the need to introduce a framework to deal primarily with those weapons that are to deal with firearms duly registered, by the licensing authority, distinct from those which should have been illicitly manufactured or trafficked into the country. In addition, we also sought to address some operational challenges that are currently faced by the licensing authority, as well as the police, and also our Office of Director in terms of their executing their respective duties. And additionally, and finally, we also saw the need to amend the Act to include provisions so that we can satisfy our international obligations under several instruments that we have signed as well as ratified. Next.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Ricardo.
So the new framework
Samantha,
seeks to establish
a
regime that targets unregulated firearms and the activities connected thereto to include illicit trade, manufacture, stockpiling, possession, and their use, as well as the treatment of regulated activities in relation to manufacture, trade, possession, and use of firearms and ammunition in Jamaica, and creating offenses for breaches of the regulated regime. We have also sought to, in terms of the penalty, ensure that these penalties that are being introduced in the new law are dissuasive and also commensurate in terms of the crime or the criminal activities that are committed and the seriousness of those activities. So the new act will see to introduce some new terms as well as provisions,
sorry to interrupt,
trafficking, dealing in.
Samantha, sorry to interrupt very quickly. I'm just giving you a warning to wrap it up. You have 1 minute and wrap it up if you don't mind. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Samantha. You have 1 minute to wrap it up.
Right. From the operational perspective, we also have continued to look at our national practices as it pertains to the management of our local stockpiles in an effort to reduce the risk of diversion. So there is ongoing and routine audits and inspections of our national stockpiles. We have also done a number of destruction activities and exercises, as well as ensure that all of the weapons that are imported and are within the country, we have captured the ballistic signature. And in terms of marking and tracing, we have also sought to ensure that the capacity in terms of our firearms and toolmarks examiner, as well as our Institute of Forensic Science and Legal Medicine, are sufficiently built out so that we can improve in terms of the tracing, of weapons that we find in the country. We have also introduced some measures to also strengthen civilian possession as well as storage and those requirements. From the perspective of our border and what we are seeking to strengthen, we saw the need to establish marine bases across certain strategic locations along the coastline. And this will be based on intelligence from the law enforcement perspective, as these areas were seen as some key areas that we should pay more attention to in terms of manning. Operationally, from the law enforcement perspective, as well as our military, we have also sought to strengthen the capacity of both those agencies as it pertains to maritime patrol by both the Coast Guard as well as the Marine Police, and building out those two divisions so that they would be in a position to adequately patrol and monitor our borders. We continue to have joint law enforcement information sharing and cooperation among the police, our officials at customs, as well as the military. in terms of detecting and intercepting illegal
Samantha?
weapons that are coming in. And of course, customs, we have
Samantha?
also seen where there is greater emphasis on looking at high-risk profile system for the screening of incoming cargo. Again, to ensure that we detect illegal weapons as well as other contraband that are coming in.
Hi, Samantha.
As it pertains to trade, we have introduced a permit, a new transit permit that would sort of streamline much of what we are doing in terms of the approvals of or the consideration of requests for the movement of conventional arms through our borders, to include small arms and light weapons. We have also sought to also ensure that brokers and brokering activities is also adequately captured, and that we're in a position to regulate much of that those activities by the country.
Samantha? Can you hear me, Samantha? I'm just going to ask you to wrap it up. We have other presentations.
As it pertains to transfer risk assessment,
we're just going to let Samantha finish. She has one more slide and we let her finish. Thank you.
My apologies, I seem to be having some technical difficulties. As it pertains to transfer risk assessment, we have also ensured that we have done our security checks and as well as due diligence of all requests for imports, export, transit, and transshipments. And we have also placed emphasis too on not allowing high risk cargo to remain on our ports for extended periods of time. And we have sought the need to ensure that those are securely transferred and placed in the custody of our military while they're in country. And we have also, as a security contingency, saw the need to also ensure that we verify all imports permits before the actual activities take place. So those are just some of the things that we have done so far. Just to wrap up, emphasis is also placed on our multilateral cooperation, and we have sought the need to also ensure that through assistance with our international partners, adopted as well as implemented some of the regional as well as international agreements. And much of this too will be from the perspective of social intervention and ensuring that not only law enforcement in terms of what we are doing from the law enforcement side, but what we are doing socially also coincides. So that's the extent of the presentation. I know I went over the time. My apologies for that, but that concludes our presentation this morning.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Ricardo, for this presentation of the citizens' perception of firearms and armed violence, and also the national measures adopted by to strengthen the regulations of firearms in Jamaica. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate Jamaica for implementing the victimization survey and its firearms module. As we know, there is a big gap in knowledge on this issue, and victimization surveys are a very effective tool to reduce the gray area of crimes. We're quite pleased with all the governmental strategies mentioned in your presentation, and we hope that this will soon lead to ratification of CIFTA by Jamaica. Ahora para seguir el conversatorio, solamente un par de cositas.
Now to continue the conversation, a couple of housekeeping issues from the moderator. First of all, thank you. We are receiving questions. We'll have a space for questions for all the moderators. We'll send them as soon as we end the presentations. Also, we'd like you to ask to maintain your microphones in mute to listen to all the presentations. And the final thing to all the panelists, please go with the time of 12 minutes for your presentation. Now let's move to the presentation of the Institute. Catherine Aguirre. Catherine, you have the floor. Thank you for this space, speaking in this important forum. 130 people that work on the field. I, as researcher in the Garapé Institute, part of the civil society, I'll give a more general vision from the understanding that we've had throughout the years on how we can look at a structured way, integrated way, the interventions to control diversions and impacts on security. And in March 8, I will focus on an important part, how that framework, we can find some entry points or policy gender focus. If you allow me, please share the presentation. That would be great. I am Catherine Aguirre. I am from Colombia. I work in the Garapé Institute of Brazil, and I am a coordinator of Masuro, which is the Latin American Network of Women on Security and Defense in Latin America. Being today the 8th, we've all discussed how violence by firearms and the impact of firearms, differentiated firearms in women, it becomes very important. The call of the participation of women in all the spaces of politics, research. So I'll give you the link and the access to that topic with Masuro later on. So if we can move to the next presentation, well, the first one is already there. It's a structure, which is a framework, a general framework on the diversion of weapons and how we can continue. So a lot of the things that we've discussed here that some of you have faced from the perspective of countries, from the perspective of multilateral organizations, that I perceive it in this framework that I've tried to develop in the past years, that moves from the idea that all firearms, or a large proportion of firearms, are born illegal in production. There's a proportion of artisanal weapons in Latin America and in Colombia, which is where I'm from. So there are a lot of possibilities of diversions that come from these international transfers, and sending them to embargo countries using usage of import certificates, falsified import certificates. I have some examples here. For example, in the armed Colombian conflict, we have this iconic case that has the participation of false fake certificates that touched several countries such as Guatemala, Panama, Nicaragua, reaching here 3,000 AK-47 to the paramilitaries. That involves the Chica Banana company. So we see that these uses of the fake certificates allows for those filtrations. Then once the weapons reach the States and are transferred, the main actors, security forces, security companies, in each of these points, there's a possibility for diversion from the point of view of the security companies. These are arsenals that are not well surveilled. So there are big possibilities of theft, of diversions to non-authorized groups, for corrupt security and violation of procedures from the point of view of handling of custody, chain of custody. We have many cases of this weapons filtration in Colombia. That was a permanent thing that continues happening in the conflict of the paramilitaries, on how this weapons diversion reaches these groups. We have evidence that in the state of Rio, there are armaments such as marking from Paraguay, and these are storages that are subject to being damaged. So in the same way, these private companies, we know that the topic of the weapons in these security companies are a very important problem in Central America, where we identify many weapons that come from these private companies. Once they reach the hands of the civilians, for example, here, for me, it's very inspiring what was mentioned in the case of Mexico when the weapons are on sale by civilian hands. We have many cases, for example, this passage of weapons from the US to Mexico, that case that you said, hey, men that buy in the border and they move the traffic for small amounts, but every time the technology makes them reach in part email, mail. So the possibilities of the point are many. So here we established policy frames using this framework. Next one, the first point added to the legal production and transferences is a big part of what gathers us here, which is this wealth of agreements, multilateral agreements, including the action plan, the instrument that tracks, that establishes this framework, this structure to regulate production, that this, we know, you know it better than me, but here it's showing one side of the chain in necessities that are quite expensive. In the side of the private security companies, we have everything regarding arsenal management and the need to set sanctions to these corrupt agents, marking and records. These needs that you, all of you, take care of are in a logic of a life of the firearm. These weapons are born, distributed, and they reach, and they are subject to be diverted in all these points. As they are recorded with better follow-up, there can be better possibilities of that diversion that has those impacts, as we saw in the case of Mexico. Once the weapons are in civilian hands, here's where the largest moment when the civil society identifies that dysfunction, if civilians can have weapons or not, or if the campaigns, this is where I identify this group of policy where we have the possibility of having a gender focus. I would divide it on the demand and offer and supply and demand. There are campaigns that incite people to not have access to those firearms, not to demand those firearms. There are other interventions, other aspects, reducing supply, having requirements to access permits. Beyond that, there are other interventions, such as measures for responsible use of weapons in the case of firearms. So let's use the time and the day to talk more about the gender focus. In this framework, don't forget this that I'm presenting here. We'll try to deaggregate it a little and see where gender focus could come in. And here, what I want to make clear is that the gender focus is not a fashion, it's a necessity, because now projects require it. It's truly a space, it's an opportunity to be able to enter something that hasn't been taken care of. For example, one issue, international instruments, there's been a large increase of participation in the 2000s on diplomatic spaces. This has been a very important topic in past years, recognizing that the presence of women in negotiations, for example, in process, generate post-conflict states that are more stable. This has been recognized in international instruments when facing firearms, in integration of agendas of women's rights, disarmament, security. These agendas mentioned that didn't have this conversation. People were on one side and they didn't get together with other security agendas of women. And for example, the impulse of the weapons treaty for women as risk factors. So now other points we have in the presentation, we have the side of sensibilization campaigns to reduce demand. So here it's all that I said talk about gender in sensibilization campaigns. It's not a fashion. It's definitely an opportunity to use the topic in the masculinity of weapons in firearms. For example, we have this phrase of the General Secretary that I think is wonderful. Proper ownership and use of weapons are strictly linked to masculinity related to control, domination, and force. The firearm campaigns consider how weapons have been, how violence has been normalized, and men are the ones that are called to take care of their women, their families with a firearm. For example, it's very important to consider how the pro-weapons, the companies, have related the empowerment of women with having a firearm. So the gender focus cannot be left out of the discussions of the sensibilization campaigns. And next, and to close, from the side of supply, there are many possibilities. If we have information systems as Dr. Baños mentioned at the beginning, there are information systems that can follow up on the threats on women, and they can talk with the data of firearms. So we have people that have prior history of violence and sexual, including they can restrict access to weapons, and this has increased a lot in Latin American region and the countries mentioned here. Also, some of the main measures when a case goes through a sentence or a case, the sanction in that that's the Latin American region is advancing a lot there. Something else that I mentioned that's very interesting as these innovating measures is what happens in Argentina, that there's a process of citizen participation where if a person wants access to a firearm, any person can oppose. Many of those oppositions come related to violence against women cases, interfamily or sexual. So here, closing and retaking, what I did here was to show a framework, a general framework of the version and entry points. And today, being March 8, I just have the presentation to mention that there are points of entry for gender focus. So to end here in the final page, you have my information, but specifically for all women that are here, if you're interested on the security and defense topic, I invite you to consult, to revise to see the website, Masuru, Amasuru, there you have it. Women in Security. It's a network with more than 400 women in all Latin America. And the idea is that working in network, we can sensibilize our work. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for this informative presentation that shows us very clearly all the points of vulnerability on the cycle of firearms that generate diversions and the illicit traffic of firearms in the region. Also, thank you for pointing out the importance of incorporating gender perspective today in March 8. So we must remember that there's a lot to do. So there I point out the importance of the organization of civil society, such as the Garape Institute, of generating qualified knowledge on the topics and the transversality of the human rights agenda and gender equality. So to finish this session of presentation, I give the floor to Pierre De Luca, a specialist of the Department of Public Security of OAS. Pierre, you have the floor. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you all. I apologize if you hear noise. This happens in a virtual environment. I have a construction around, so I will share my screen with the presentation. I imagine you can see my presentation now. So thank you, Guillermo. I'm happy to be the last panelist today because my colleagues have given me all the context for my presentation. My presentation will be focused more on the strategies that from the Department of Public Security we adopted to contribute to strengthening the capacities of the member states of the OAS in diverting the illicit traffic of munitions. So we've seen in our colleagues' presentations how it prevails in the hemisphere as the main problems that affect the development of the life of the citizens, and how the transnational crime is one of the main threats to the safety of the countries. Based on that, the Department of Public Security has worked to support the member states in the framework of SICTA. One of our actions is to generate qualified knowledge on the phenomena. Despite the data that we've seen, there's still a lot of holes in the knowledge to expect to know the phenomena better. So considering that the member states in OAS have moved through 4 mandates, so that both the Public Security Department and the Department of Energy, that we've developed a hemispheric study on illicit traffic of firearms in the Americas. This complements the studies that are present globally or subnationally and go deeper on the topic in the region. This mandate wasn't possible to implement because of lack of funds until in 2021. Thanks to the investment of Mexico CIFTA Fund, we are very grateful to the government of Mexico, allowed us to implement this mandate with the incorporation of a methodology. The objective of the methodology is to be able to develop a periodical study. So the idea is to analyze the trends and see how this data evolves. The capacities to fight illicit trade, as we mentioned, we have three specific objectives. The first one will be to understand the trends, the patterns, characteristics of the region. We have a lot with the global study of firearms, but trying to focus it on the region of the Americas. We have a component of identifying threats in the state capacities. Understanding the state capacities are one of the main ways to prevent the diversion and illicit traffic. Finally, to produce practical recommendations for the countries so that the study is perceptive, it can orient the countries on the priorities for next years. And also transversally, being today March 8, I must point out that the study has a gender perspective and vulnerability groups facing the differentiated impact of firearms, and knowing that the study recognizes and wants to visualize the impact of traffic on communities and armed violence. I won't go deeper into that, but as I mentioned, the state capacity, our main objective in analyzing the state capacity, the hypothesis, which one is more robust in a firearm control system, less diversions, and capacity to control illicit trade. So what we want is to operationalize and measure state capacity to control firearms, considering the international obligations, not only of SICTA, but also the standards of the universal systems such as MOSAIC, that truly gives us a step-by-step for all the dimensions that a state should have to control all these firearms that, as Catherine mentioned, all these vulnerable points. Here, this is a very fast scheme of what we visualize that are the main tools for a collection of information in these tests. The state capacity, we want a questionnaire where countries can accompany how they evolve in improving their capacities to do a methodology, qualitative methodology, to listen to the actors. Many of you are present today. Listen to your perspectives, all that you have to provide on the work that you do, and present these recommendations and identify the strengths. The implementation of this study, we are in the second phase. We've analyzed the exploration phase. Right now, we are developing the methodology that we expect to have ready for the second half of the year to present, to see that and validate it, so that we can get financing for the first edition of the study with the support of a advising technical committee where we are inviting specialists of various sectors of the civil society, of the international community, of the governments, trying to make this study to be as comprehensive and participational possible. Having said that, generating knowledge, the work of the public security department is focused on operational support for countries to apply the obligations of international conventions. We do that through the program of assistance for firearm control. This program is financed by the European Union. This phase of the project ends May this year, and we have everything ready to renovate it in a second phase that would be plus 3 years of support to the countries. The objective is to support the member states in reducing the armed violence through 3 action lines of action. First is strengthening the regulation frameworks for firearms, and I was very glad to hear Samantha and Ricardo talking about is one of the countries that we've supported in the regulation framework. We also improve institutional capacities to control the cycle with marking, tracking, record, destruction of weapons, obsolete weapons, physical security arsenals, and we incorporate the prevention of armed violence, understanding that it's necessary also to reduce demand of demands, not only control offer, not only control supply. Those are complementary. From this phase, financed by the European Union to December 21, we've supported more than 18 countries, more than 1,000 officials that have been trained in these aspects of firearms. We've supported 16 countries in marking by 9 machines donated in 6 countries. We've developed the destruction missions, certifying our processes with more than 37 tons of munitions and 3,000 weapons have been destroyed. We've supported 5 countries with improvements in their warehouses, the security in their warehouses, with implementation of a inventory control software to better control inventory and reduce possibilities of diversions that's into the illicit market. And we've assisted 5 countries in the strengthening of their regulations framework. Jamaica was one of the countries benefited. So we've worked with prevention of armed violence with a pilot project in Honduras, in Salvador. We've offered daily activities to youths in risk situations to improve their resilience to armed violence and we've trained community actors in the topic of violence prevention, how to better assist the victims. The courses were developed considering the circumstances of each group. We've worked from educators to the parents, and we are accompanying them through the process. And finally, in the framework of them, we're strengthening regional cooperation. We're creating a virtual community where we have 25 contact point in recorded countries where there's an informal space to exchange information and good practices, and we're developing the structure of the communication mechanism on illicit transference of firearms and munitions, MS7A, that I will stop a little and give you the context of this tool that we truly believe in its potential to help strengthen the control mechanisms between countries. So how do we know the topic of legal commerce of firearms? That it should be regulated as a way to reduce the vulnerable points and diversions to illicit trade. The intention of MSCPA is to, at the same time, facilitate that the actors that can make the transfers and the transactions participate on this process. The objective is to apply Article 9 of CIFTA. This article has provisions that are very similar to the protocol of firearms, and Article 9 says that countries must maintain national systems for licenses for import, export, and transit, and that the state must cooperate and communicate because states must make sure that all of the countries involved in transfers have issued the respective licenses. Transit of firearms is prohibited if these licenses are not duly issued. And if requested, the importing state must report the materials to track these weapons. What we see here is that most countries have their national systems, but in the international cooperation environment, there's a lot to do. So the objective of the MC7A is to offer the safe exchange environment to share those processes between the authorities to notify this issuance or denial of these licenses, to generate consultations, and to have statistics to standardize the minimum information of these processes. The MS7A doesn't replace the national systems. It would be a voluntary use for countries, and we hope that as countries can see the benefits, the system can grow and even include countries that are out of the hemisphere. You have 1 minute, Pierre. Thank you, Guillermo. Of course, there are many challenges to implement the MS7A. There are challenges, lack of standardization, the scope of the system, technology challenges, sustainability, regulation of data. So that's why we are doing a very open process of dialogue with the countries. We developed guidelines, basic guidelines with the Civil Guard of Spain based on good practices of the European Union. And we're working on validation and review of these guidelines to guarantee that they are adapted on needs and possibilities. We formed 2 technical committees with 20 countries of the region participating, where we're reviewing each of the points and proposing strategies and courses of action to reach a successful result. I'm very glad to see many of the participants of the committees in the event today. So that would be to end. We bet on the MS7A, and we want your support to make it a useful mechanism for the countries, and we are at your service to support through Batam. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pierre. And also important, thank you for pointing out the work of the department to attend these problems. As an interim director of the department, I am very happy for all the accomplishments that we're doing. I've been a witness of all the impact of our operational work in the countries, such as the missions of destruction of weapons and munitions in the countries that we supported. And also, I would like to point out the relevance of the regional mechanism on illicit transfer of firearms as a strategy, as an effective strategy, as my colleague Pierre mentioned the MS7A. So it's important that in the framework of SIFTA, this mechanism can be eventually approved to reduce the diversion points in the market and to promote the approach and the collaboration between government authorities in the region. So in that way, incentivize the governments of the region in this process to have a final successful product. In fact, this conversation, as my colleague Pierre mentioned, there are many of you connected, and that also makes it more important of the process in the Department of Public Security. So once the interventions have been finalized, I want to point out the high representativeness of the representation of women. The representation of women. Here, more than half of our panelists are women today. I'm sure it's not enough, but it shows that it's possible to incorporate gender perspective in all aspects, including better female participation in the design, implementation, and evaluation of public security policies. So now we move to the open dialogue, where we will answer questions from the audience. Remember to request the floor or send the questions through the chat. I'd like to begin the dialogue with questions. We have questions from the students, and the first question, and I'm sorry if I don't see it in the screen, I was do multitasking here. I have several questions here from Zoom and from other platforms. From our conversation, the first one would be for the legal consultant, Alejandro, the lawyer from Mexico. What is the approximate number of weapons that the companies do say that have been stolen from their arsenals? You have the floor, Alejandro. Thank you, Guillermo. First of all, very interesting, the elements. The companies don't report in awareness the amount of weapons they lose, and this is a topic that is important. The importance of traceability, the weapons, there are phantom weapons, home manufactured weapons, but in general, they have a serial numbers, and the manufacturing companies could do a lot to establish mechanisms where it's easier to track weapons. If we could, as a people, as governments, to know the route of traceability for a weapon, it would be simpler to identify patterns, routes, and our government actions, more effective government actions. The absence of public information of traceability that could be done easily, and there's a call to the government for that, would allow us to demystify this narrative that says that most weapons that exist in Mexico and in our region come from other countries, when in reality, in Mexico is between 70 and 90%, and in other countries in the region it's about 56%. They come from United States manufacturer. There's also something that says that most of the weapons come from desertions or losses of security forces of the governments that are comparison here, when really it's not like that. In Mexico, the portion is between 70 and 90% coming from the United States, and just barely 3% comes from illegal imports. So the overwhelming majority of weapons found in crime scenes come from the illegal traffic of weapons. This illegal traffic of weapons is $250 a year, so that is very profitable for the countries, for the companies that we are suing. Thank you for the information and for the data that you just provided. I will move to the next question for our colleagues in Jamaica, Ricardo Edwards and Samantha Allen.
Hopefully will be the right translation for the question. Based on the efforts that Jamaica has undertaken to implement the international instruments to combat arms trafficking, what is the consideration that your government gives to the possibility of ratifying the CIFTA? Samantha and Ricardo, can you please take the floor?
Okay, thank you so much, Guillermo. All right, so in terms of advancements that we would have made so far, the review that is currently being done of our national legislation treating with firearms, much of what we are seeking to do in terms of introducing provisions as it relates to the trafficking of firearms, which would not have been captured previously in the law, as well as diversion, and a lot of new definitions as well, brokering and monitoring brokering activities. So from the legislative perspective, we have certainly commenced, and we are at an advanced stage in terms of putting into law the requirements of the CIFTA as it pertains to regulating firearms and ammunition. Similarly, we are also now putting some focus on the similar review of legislation governing explosives. So that now is a process that we are putting more attention on now in terms of having a comprehensive and complete review done of all the local legislation governing explosives and the use and possession of those items, so that we are in a position to be in full compliance. From the operational perspective, certainly much of what we are doing in terms of physical security and stockpile management, we have introduced all of the practices as it pertains to the small arms compendium, as well as guidelines for the ammunition technical activities. So we are doing those things, and that's ongoing. Disposal, marking, we are seeking to introduce that in our law. We would have commenced the national marking program, but that is something that we are also seeking to introduce in our domestic legislation. So we have taken advanced steps from both the legislative perspective as well as the operational side to be in a position to fully comply with the requirements of the SIFTA.
Thank you, Samantha. And to your answer, I want to do a follow-up question that we just received as well. I wanted to ask you and ask Ricardo, if whoever wants to take the opportunity to answer this question, what is the most important change in terms of the firearms legislation to avoid the illicit traffic in your country? If you can point out the most important change. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, Guillermo. So I will take this one again. So the most important change that I will highlight is that we are, as I said, introducing a lot of these terms that would not have already been captured under our current act. From that perspective, certainly we would be in a position now to arrest persons who are found to be trafficking weapons as well as ammunition, and certainly to prosecute from the legislative perspective. The approach that we're taking in terms of having separate regimes to treat with weapons that are regulated currently by our licensing authority and that we have registered in our system, as opposed to those that we have no knowledge of and that would have entered our country through some illicit means. I think it is also significant in terms of where we are seeking to go and the message that we are sending as it pertains to detecting and also prosecuting persons who are found to be in possession of illegal or unregistered weapons, and also who are found to be committing activities, illicit activities with these weapons.
Muchas gracias, Samantha, por las respuestas. Y ahora, para agilizar también.
Thank you, Samantha, for the answers. I'll move the question. The next question to Catherine Aguirre from the INAPEM. This question comes from Zoom. What is your suggestion to avoid the illegal access of parts and pieces of firearms through the courier in the customs? You're in mute, Catherine. Yes, well, here I feel very limited because truly those that are on the floor underground are you, but definitely it's applying and recognizing that all of these instruments, for example, Mosaic, have advanced a lot in recognizing that these possibilities exist and consider that the intention of the criminals, of the criminal groups, does not have a limit. So there I wouldn't have anything to provide on the technical side. Maybe some of the people or the people of the group can talk more, but I think what's important here is to recognize that these possibilities exist, these creative possibilities exist. One of the largest cases of traffic of weapons to Brazil from Miami was weapons hidden in maintenance tanks for full maintenance tanks. So you that are on the field are the ones that face these possibilities. for criminals. Thank you, Catherine. And an additional question that just came for follow-up. I wanted to ask, how effective has it been to implement these international instruments that help to fight illicit trafficking in states that have high impact of illicit traffic of firearms in countries such as you mentioned, our Mexico colleague Alejandro Celorio, like Mexico. Again, I asked the question, how effective has implementation been for these international instruments that help fight illicit traffic in the states that have high impact of illicit trade of firearms in countries such as Mexico? Well, here I wanted with this answer to move it to what would be the vision from the academia of the effectiveness of any public policy. Here we must implement tests that allow for I don't know at the Latin America level any study. For the case of Mexico, there is a point where we can see a change, but it would be a very difficult policy to evaluate, talking from the monitoring and evaluation side, because it would be very difficult to isolate the other aspects that are linked to traffic and violence. There are other evaluations such as prevention campaigns, the deliveries, the voluntary deliveries of firearms, or the commissioning of restrictions on carrying weapons. Yes, we've done some epidemiology studies that show that we've done some restrictions on in Colombian cities such as Bogotá or Cali or Sao Paulo. We've determined that murder rates and accidents and suicide have dropped. So we must think that each of those efficiency questions must carry an evaluation and isolation of the factors. Very difficult to say if this provided something. So this is a response of cases. Thank you, Kathy, for the answer. And I think they are requesting the floor, Florencia Perez. Before Florencia, I have one more question to ask that we've gotten through Zoom for the Department of Public Security for my colleague Pierre. And the next question is, in the Department of Public Security, providing support for normative adaptation of countries that they've requested through the OAS, and to move forward and everyone adapting to a standard norm with the specificities of each. You could give us an example of that, about that, Pierre, in the case of harmonizing the laws. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you for the question. The topic of legislative harmonization is something that we've tried to prioritize, and having a learned lesson of the first phases that the countries that have in their legislation all the international applications that are much better positioned to maintain all the help, all the support, and that we support and that we provide a country that has the marking, the mandatory marking in their legislation of firearm legislation has much more chance to keep doing marking in our machine. They're receiving training. So that's why we see how the essential role for the international cooperation that we'll be offering. The topic of the question, if we move forward in general with all the hemisphere, or if there is a specific request from the countries, it could be both ways. There is an effort, a standardized effort on a hemispheric way, not only in the inter-American, but the international standards that we mentioned, Mosaic, for example. There is also standards on the topic of CIFTA. CIFTA, in addition to the convention, has a whole model legislation that was approved by the member states, which the purpose is of helping states implement CIFTA in their own legislation. So there's a model law for the criminalization of the behaviors. There's a model law for the topic of control in border points. There are different model laws. There are 8 in addition to the regulations of the standards. There's the standard of marking, Inter-American marking. So all of this is available on the website of CIPTA. I'll add it on the chat. So there are these regional efforts that we want to continue working on them. The next phase of the project, we've planned to do standards of destruction of physical security and standards for the topic of incorporation of gender perspective and prevention of gender violence with the use of firearms. On the other hand, there are individual requests, as I mentioned, in the case of Jamaica, but in this phase, first phase of the project, we work with Jamaica, Salvador, Ecuador, Peru, these countries, and Panama. These countries have received our individual support to review their legislations and make specific to do drafts of legislations to change it and other legislative. Because it's a big support that can be individualized. Thank you, Pierre, for the answer and for being so explicit on harmonizing laws on international frameworks. I'll move the floor to Florencia Perez from the National Agency for Control and Materials in Argentina. Florencia, you have the floor to ask your question. Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. First of all, thank you for the invitation. We're here in this conversation with my colleague Ignacio Pachetti to provide the floor. I know we have little time. I'll be very brief. I want to share some activities and initiatives on control materials. As we mentioned, this is a decentralized entity that depends on the Justice Center. It's control materials that with each of its activities is controls and revitalizes the compliance of weapons and explosives nationally. So I think it's very curious that the colleague from the Institute has mentioned the public policies of the organism when she mentioned citizen, this system that the citizens have to oppose each authorization that the agency could provide to a request of possession or legitimate user. The agency, as of 2015, increases its competence because it has competence merely of record, and the new law, the 27192, increases the possibility to collaborate with justice and develop and participate on developing a criminal policy. So this is why we have contact with the judicial models. We are auxiliaries in all the topic. We have a specialized office on illicit with firearms, and we work with them in collaboration. This is a very important day, March 8th. So it's very important to mention that in Argentina, we have official records, and in 2020, we committed more than 251 feminicides. These feminicides, so this agency has a high commitment to be able to design a public policy that includes gender perspective. There's 99% of legitimate users that are males, and only 1% of the legitimate users are women. So this is why on each development of policies and actions taken, it's necessary to bear in mind these statistics, because it's what marks this road and where we want to generate some kind of change. So we wanted to use that to make these statistics visible and just tell you some actions that we're conducting. We have the signature of the executive director on the day. It's a resolution project, so that all the shooting structure in this organism can answer and train on a gender's perspective. and gender issues. So from Mariana, all the shooting instructors will mandatorily have to answer questions related to gender perspective. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that we have communication and we collaborate, we work together with the Ministry of Women. Argentina has a ministry specialized on this, the Ministry of Women in the university that was created in 2019. So we have an agreement and collaboration framework and joint action, and we work with them to generate public policies related to that. I also wanted to mention that we have possibility and the norm establishes so to inhabilitate those users that have reports on, we're doing federal mapping to have concrete statistics and a record of all the reports that come to the organism for gender violence. So it's important to point out also that Law 26485, Article 26 prevents the possibility to sequester those weapons when there's a report and an open cause for illegal possession of weapons and violence against women. So point this out. And finally, also mention that in Argentina, we have the program of voluntary delivery. We have it since 1997, which is an essential program for illicit traffic of weapons because the main purpose is to reduce weapons in society. More than 209,000 weapons were delivered on our delivery plan, and we are still working on the problem and mainly training and developing a strong prevention policy. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Florencia, and congratulations to Argentina for all the support that you're
No tenemos mucho tiempo, tenemos
much time. We have basically 13 minutes, so I want to apologize to the attendees that are asking for the floor. I must wrap up and I must close for our panelists, and I wanted in this space that we have left to offer the floor to our panelists to offer their final comments. And I'd like to start with Jamaica. Then we will move to Catherine from Garapé, then the public department with Pierre, and then Alejandro Celorio from Mexico, if you will. I'll offer the floor to Jamaica. Samantha, for your final comments. Samantha?
Yes, ma'am. Hi, thank you so much, Guillermo. All right, so thank you again to the government of Mexico as well as the Department of State for organizing this event that is significant as it pertains to the challenge that we all currently face in terms of trying to treat with firearms, illicit firearms that we find in our country, and our attempts also at putting in place the various mechanisms to ensure that we can adequately arrest, prosecute, and the perpetrators who are found to have these weapons and are committing crimes, but also to secure and strengthen our borders to prevent them from coming in the first place. We would like to just reiterate our commitment again to the requirements of the SIFTA and what we need to do to ensure that we are in full compliance. We have taken advanced steps, and we will continue in that regard to ensure that we have satisfied all that is required, and we're in a position to report that we have in fact we're in a position to ratify the SIFTA. So thank you so much again for inviting my colleague and I, Ricardo, to this exercise, and my apologies again for the time that we went over in terms of the presentation.
Thank you, Samantha, and don't worry about the time. Your presentation was very important in this event, so Thank you, and also to your colleague Ricardo for being here today. I want to yield the floor ahora a Catherine Aguirre del Instituto de Garapé.
Move the floor with Catherine Aguirre for her final comment. We have 2 minutes. Just thank, because I see that this is a group that definitely knows these topics on the floor, in the field. As a member of the civil society, bringing together and showing that the perception that I have is that the weapons control is involved in those two extremes of the international agreements and the discussion of, and in all these discussions, there are many more points that could get to be most important ones, such as the filtration of private companies or the public part. So just thank through this space and point out that gender focus is a very important opportunity to give vitality to the topic of the citizens committee that would have stayed out because it doesn't consider the topic where the firearms move and invite women to learn Masuro and work and go into this network. Thank you very much, Catherine, for that information that mentioned. It's important to point out everything that can be done with regards to gender inclusion in these topics, and also invite all the colleagues to the Catherine is making to add up to this initiative. I'll move the floor to my colleague Pierre Angeline Peluca for her final comments. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you, Guillermo. On my side, just to reiterate the thanks for this space for the government of Mexico. They have, in the case of FITA, they have a couple of years supporting us in our initiatives. And just following up on what Catherine mentioned, reiterate the importance of bearing weapons control on these two perspectives, not only the topic of supply. The work that we do with international conventions is very focused on supply, manufacture of firearms, tracking transference, but the topic of demand, working in our communities for a peaceful culture, less violence, so that there's less demand to resolve conflicts through firearms. This is the message that we want to work on the Department of Public Security. We think it's important to have this transfer focus from supply to demand, that this is how we go with our new initiatives in the second phase of the project with the European Union. So I also take this to thank the European Union, and through this focus of supply and demand, I think it also generates a lot of spaces to incorporate supply and demand, how women are more affected by armed violence, what are the different shows. I end with this final message of having this perspective, multidimensional perspective, which is what we adopt in the OAS through this focus of human rights. Thank you very much. Thank you, Per. Thank you for pointing out the importance of international instruments in this topic. Now, finally, I move the floor to our colleague of Mexico, Alejandro Celorio. Alejandro, you have the floor. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Guillermo. Thank you for the participation to the panelists. Very important for the effort that I have the honor of coordinating. Final reflection. We must overcome the notion that illicit weapons trade is solved only with contention. The flows of illicit people trade, it's not only contention in the borders. We have to go to the root cause. Also, same for illicit drugs. We must go on consumption. So as Pierre Angeli mentioned, supply and demand. And in the case of illicit weapons trade, we must understand who is generating this demand. And I close with this reflection. There is an insistence on appealing on fragile masculinities. Reiterate that having a weapon gives a sensation of security, masculinity, of manhood that we shouldn't allow to grow. The state is the one that has a monopoly on the use of force, and only the state must have, with proper regulation, the use of this type of military weapons. The private people, private persons, if they want weapons, they must use them for what the social contract in various states determines. Recreational activities, collection, target practice, that's the way the product should be offered as a recreational element, not as a tool to kill and wound women. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and we'll be here. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Thank you to all the panelists. We are reaching to the end of the conversation. We have many more questions in our platforms. Undoubtedly, this is a very important conversation. We'll continue the second conversation, April 25th. It's good to have this call and the attendance of all of us all. This first conversation undoubtedly will continue in future conversations. As we've seen today in the presentations, as I mentioned, a very productive dialogue. It's important to strengthen the systems of collection, systematization, and data analysis to improve and understand the dynamics related to the diversion of and traffic of firearms. So it's essential that the international community, the governments, the academia, civil society, and the private sector exchange information through tools and existing studies. It's the analysis of that data that will allow us to design public policies and evaluate their efficiency. On the other hand, it's essential to support the member states of the OAS so that they can implement the necessary measures to establish robust systems that can allow for control of flow of firearms from the manufacturer to the final destination. Technology information is a very effective tool for that, to that end, to improve the communication amongst the various actors and countries involved in these processes. It is essential that we continue prioritizing the topic and pointing out the negative effects of the manufacture and illicit trade of firearms in the region to generate shared liabilities amongst all the actors on this problem. From the Department of Public Security of OAS, we are at your service to work together and support the government so that we can reduce armed violence that causes so much damage to our citizens. Before ending, I'd like to reiterate our thanks to the mission of Mexico in the OAS, Ambassador Baños, for your support and your constant support and determined support. Thank you to our guests for sharing with us your knowledge and experience. And I'd like to reiterate the importance of working together to prevent the diversion and traffic of illicit firearms in the Americas. I also mentioned extend the invitation for the second conversation in this series that will be conducted on April 5th, focused on fighting assets laundering as a strategy to destructure criminal groups. This conversation will be led by our Department Against Transnational Organized Crime. That's a commercial for you to be with us on April 5th. I hope you have a good day. See you later. This is not a goodbye. It's see you later and see you soon.
The recording has stopped.